She's at the bottom of the pool. The scream sliced through the violin music like shattered glass, and for one frozen second, nobody moved. Crystal chandeliers reflected across the black water while guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos stood motionless beside the Whitmore Estates infinity pool, champagne glasses still hanging in their hands. Then Maya Brooks saw it. A small pale hand drifting beneath the surface. Sophie Whitmore. 8 years old. Floating face down under the shimmering lights of a $10 million backyard party. Maya dropped the silver serving tray before her mind could catch up with her body. Glass exploded across the marble patio as she ran. "Call 911, someone shouted, but the voice sounded distant beneath the pounding in her ears. Richard Whitmore turned too late, confusion crossing his sharp features as the crowd suddenly parted. Evelyn Whitmore gasped softly, one trembling hand rising to her diamond necklace as if her mind refused to understand what her eyes were seeing. Maya didn't stop to remove her shoes. She didn't stop to think about the guests staring at her. She launched herself into the freezing water in her black server uniform just as Sophie's body sank deeper beneath the reflections of the party lights. The cold hit like needles against her skin. Her soaked sleeves dragged heavily against her arms as she reached downward through the blue glow beneath the surface. Sophie's long blonde hair drifted around her face like ribbons underwater. Maya grabbed the little girl around the waist and kicked upward with everything she had. The moment they broke the surface, the music stopped. Complete silence swept across the patio except for the sound of water crashing against the edge of the pool. "Oh my God," Evelyn whispered. Maya pulled Sophie onto the marble beside the pool, her own chest heaving violently as water streamed from her uniform onto the stone. Sophie wasn't moving. Her skin looked frighteningly pale beneath the party lights. Richard finally rushed forward, panic replacing the polished calm that made him famous on magazine covers and financial news channels. "Sophie?" His voice cracked for the first time all night. "Sophie." Maya pressed trembling fingers against the girl's neck. Nothing. Around them, wealthy investors and socialites stood frozen in horror, suddenly useless without assistants, drivers, or security teams to tell them what to do. Maya tilted Sophie's chin carefully and listened for breath. Still nothing. Evelyn collapsed to her knees beside her daughter, mascara already beginning to streak beneath her eyes. "Please," she whispered shakily. "Please do something." Maya looked down at the child lying motionless beneath the mansion lights, and suddenly all she could hear was her own mother's voice from years ago inside a crowded emergency room in Atlanta. "When people panic, baby, you breathe first. Then you move." Maya swallowed hard and placed both hands gently against Sophie's chest. The cold night air carried the scent of chlorine, roses, and rain drifting in from somewhere far beyond the estate walls. "Come on, sweetheart," Maya whispered softly as her hands began to press downward. "Stay with me. Breathe, Sophie. Come on, baby, breathe." Maya's voice trembled as her hands pressed rhythmically against the little girl's chest, water dripping from her fingertips onto the marble patio. Every second felt impossibly loud now that the music had stopped. The billionaire guests who had spent the evening laughing beside crystal fire pits stood completely silent around the pool, their expensive shoes soaked by rainwater and chlorine. Richard Whitmore hovered helplessly nearby, his face drained of color as he stared at his daughter lying motionless beneath the glow of hanging lanterns. Evelyn clutched her own arms tightly, shaking so hard that the diamonds around her wrists rattled softly. Maya leaned closer, listening for even the smallest breath, but there was only silence. Her wet curls clung to her cheeks as cold winds swept across the estate. Then suddenly Sophie coughed. A weak, painful sound. Water spilled from the corner of the little girl's mouth as her body jerked slightly against the marble. Evelyn let out a broken sob and collapsed beside her daughter, one trembling hand flying over her mouth. "Oh my God. Sophie." Richard dropped to his knees. Immediately, his expensive suit soaking against the wet stone as he reached for Sophie's hand. Maya exhaled shakily for the first time since diving into the pool. Her own hands would not stop trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Somewhere beyond the gates of the estate, distant sirens began cutting through the night air. Sophie's eyelids fluttered weakly. "Mom," she whispered hoarsely. Evelyn burst into tears at the sound of her daughter's voice and pulled Sophie gently against her chest. Richard lowered his head, his shoulders tightening as relief crashed through him all at once. Around them, guests quietly stepped backward, the glamour of the evening suddenly feeling small and hollow compared to the frightened little girl wrapped in her mother's arms. Maya slowly stood, water streaming from the hem of her black uniform onto the marble floor beneath her feet. Nobody looked at her at first. Their attention remained locked on Sophie. She understood that. It was how houses like this worked. People like Maya existed quietly in the background until something went wrong. Then suddenly everybody noticed them at once. A paramedic team rushed through the open patio doors moments later carrying equipment bags and oxygen tanks. Questions filled the air immediately. How long was she underwater? Does she have asthma? Was there any head injury? Maya stepped back instinctively to give them space, but before she could disappear into the crowd, one of the paramedics glanced toward her soaked uniform. "You pulled her out?" Maya nodded once. "And started CPR?" "Yes, sir." The paramedic looked briefly toward Richard and Evelyn, then back at Maya with quiet respect. "You saved her life." The words seemed to hang strangely in the cold night air. Richard looked up slowly for the first time since Sophie regained consciousness. His eyes settled on Maya fully now, almost as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time since she had started working at the estate 6 months earlier. Rain began falling harder overhead, soft drops tapping against the surface of the pool where Sophie had nearly disappeared forever. Maya lowered her eyes quickly, uncomfortable beneath the sudden attention. "I just did what anybody would do," she said quietly. But deep down, she knew that was not true. Because while everyone else had frozen beside the water, she had moved. The ambulance lights faded into the distance just after midnight, leaving the Whitmore estate strangely quiet beneath the steady rain. The enormous backyard that had been glowing with laughter and music only an hour earlier now looked cold and abandoned. Half-empty champagne glasses sat forgotten on silver trays beside damp linen napkins fluttering in the wind. Staff members moved silently through the patio collecting broken glass and folding chairs while thunder rolled softly beyond the hills. Maya stood alone near the service entrance wrapped in a gray towel one of the kitchen workers had handed her after the paramedics left. Her soaked shoes squeaked faintly against the marble floor as she stared down at her trembling hands. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced by exhaustion deep in her bones. "You should go home." Maya looked up. Mrs. Keller, the estate manager, stood in the doorway holding a dry sweater folded carefully over one arm. Her silver hair was pulled tightly into its usual bun, but her eyes looked softer tonight. "Thank you," Maya said quietly as she accepted the sweater. Mrs. Keller hesitated before speaking again. "They are still at the hospital. Sophie is stable." Maya closed her eyes briefly with relief. Stable. The word loosened something tight inside her chest. "Good," she whispered. Mrs. Keller studied her for a long moment. "You saw it before anyone else, did you not?" Maya nodded slowly. She was coughing during dinner. Why did nobody say anything? Maya glanced toward the darkened dining room where expensive floral arrangements still covered the long tables in white lilies and orchids. "I tried." The older woman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She understood immediately. In houses like this, workers learned quickly when to speak and when to disappear. Maya had crossed that invisible line tonight. Mrs. Keller gave a faint sigh. "Go upstairs and change before you leave. You are freezing." Maya climbed the back staircase slowly, exhaustion dragging at every step. The servant hallway on the 3rd floor smelled faintly of bleach and lavender detergent. Small yellow lights glowed overhead while rain tapped softly against the narrow windows. Everything here felt completely different from the marble hallways downstairs. Simpler. Quieter. Real. Inside her tiny room beside the laundry area, Maya sat heavily on the edge of the bed and stared at the framed photograph resting near the lamp. Her mother smiled back at her from the picture, wearing faded blue nursing scrubs and holding a paper cup of coffee outside Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. Maya picked up the frame gently, tracing the corner with her thumb. "You would have known what to do faster," she whispered softly. Outside the room, hurried footsteps suddenly echoed down the hallway. Maya looked up just as another housekeeper rushed past the open door. "They are back already," the woman whispered nervously. Maya stood immediately, her stomach tightening. Through the upstairs railing she could see the front doors downstairs opening as Richard Whitmore entered carrying Sophie carefully in his arms beneath a wool hospital blanket. Evelyn walked beside them with red swollen eyes, one hand resting protectively against her daughter's hair. The mansion remained silent as they crossed the enormous foyer together. No phones. No assistants. No conversations about stock markets or investors. Just two frightened parents carrying their child home. Then Sophie lifted her tired head slightly from her father's shoulder and looked upward toward the staircase. Her small eyes found Maya standing quietly in the shadows above. For a brief second, the little girl smiled weakly. Richard followed his daughter's gaze upward. And once again, his eyes landed on Maya. The next morning, the Whitmore mansion no longer sounded like a place built for parties and business deals. The silence felt different now. Softer. Careful. Rain clouds still hung low across the gray Connecticut sky while pale morning light filtered through the enormous windows overlooking the gardens. Maya moved quietly through the breakfast room, arranging plates of fruit beside untouched silverware. Normally. By 8 o'clock, assistants would already be moving through the house with tablets and phone calls, preparing Richard Whitmore for meetings in Manhattan. But today there were no voices echoing through the marble halls. No financial news playing on the televisions. No guests. Only the faint ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere deeper in the estate. Maya placed a small bowl of sliced strawberries carefully onto the dining table just as Sophie entered the room wearing oversized white pajamas and fuzzy socks. The little girl moved slowly, still pale from the night before, but alive. Very alive. Maya felt her chest loosen slightly at the sight. "You should still be resting," Evelyn said gently as she followed behind her daughter carrying a glass of water. Maya nearly froze at the sound of her voice. She had worked in the Whitmore house for 6 months and had never once heard Evelyn Whitmore speak softly to anyone. Especially not during breakfast. Sophie climbed carefully into one of the large dining chairs and immediately looked toward Maya. "Can she stay?" The question hung awkwardly in the air. Evelyn blinked. "Who?" Sophie pointed directly at Maya. "Her." Maya lowered her eyes immediately. "It is okay, sweetheart. I should get back to the kitchen." No, Sophie's small voice came out stronger this time. "I want her here." Richard entered the room at that exact moment, dressed not in one of his expensive tailored suits, but in a dark cashmere sweater and jeans that made him look strangely less untouchable than usual. He stopped near the doorway when he noticed the tension at the table. His eyes shifted briefly toward Maya before settling on Sophie. "Everything okay?" Sophie nodded quickly. "I just want Maya to eat breakfast with us." The room fell completely still. One of the younger kitchen staff standing near the doorway nearly dropped a coffee pot. Employees did not sit at the Whitmore table. Ever. Maya felt heat rise into her face immediately. "No, that is not appropriate," Evelyn answered carefully, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. Sophie looked down at her plate, disappointment clouding her tired little face. Richard remained silent for several seconds. Then unexpectedly, He pulled out the empty chair beside Sophie and looked directly at Maya. Sit down. Maya thought she had heard him wrong. Sir? You heard me. His voice stayed calm, but there was something unfamiliar underneath it now. Not authority. Something closer to humility. Every instinct inside Maya told her to refuse. Workers like her survived in houses like this by staying invisible, by understanding lines that were never spoken aloud. But Sophie was already smiling weakly up at her from the table. Slowly, Maya sat down at the edge of the chair as though afraid the moment itself might shatter if she moved too quickly. Mrs. Keller quietly dismissed the other staff from the doorway, sensing this breakfast was no longer ordinary. Sunlight slipped softly through the windows, warming the polished table where 4 people now sat together in uncomfortable silence. Then Sophie reached over and wrapped her tiny fingers around Maya's hand beneath the tablecloth. Richard saw it. So did Evelyn. Neither of them spoke. But for the first time since Maya entered their lives, the invisible wall between the billionaire family and the black maid who had saved their daughter no longer looked quite as solid as it once had. By late afternoon, sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds and spilled across the Whitmore estate in long golden streaks, warming the wet stone pathways outside the mansion. Sophie sat curled beneath a blanket in the sunroom overlooking the gardens, quietly drawing with colored pencils while soft piano music drifted from hidden ceiling speakers. Maya folded laundry nearby at the large oak table, careful not to disturb the peaceful silence that had settled between them. Every few minutes Sophie glanced up just to make sure Maya was still there. It reminded Maya painfully of children in hospital waiting rooms watching nurses disappear behind curtains, afraid the comforting person might not come back. Do you like butterflies too? Sophie asked suddenly without looking up from her drawing pad. Maya smiled faintly. My mother did. Sophie held up the picture proudly. Purple butterflies covered the page beside a crooked little pond and 4 stick figures standing together under the sun. Maya noticed immediately that one of the figures had dark brown skin shaded carefully with marker. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed through the hallway outside the sunroom. Evelyn entered first, still dressed elegantly despite the exhaustion beneath her eyes. Richard followed behind her carrying a slim black folder tucked beneath one arm. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Sophie lowered her crayons. Maya stood politely from the table. Sir. Ma'am. Richard stopped beside the windows, his gaze lingering briefly on Sophie before turning toward Maya. We need to talk. Maya felt tension tighten quietly in her stomach. People with money always sounded calm before changing someone else's life. She folded the towel in her hands more carefully. Of course. Sophie immediately looked nervous. She is not leaving, right? Evelyn crossed the room quickly and sat beside her daughter. No, sweetheart. Nobody is leaving. But even Evelyn's voice carried uncertainty underneath it. Richard opened the folder slowly and removed several papers. The doctors reviewed Sophie's records this morning, he said. Apparently she has been showing respiratory warning signs for months. Maya stayed silent. The specialist believes exposure to certain flowers triggered the reaction last night. His eyes shifted toward the lilies still visible outside in decorative garden beds near the patio. You noticed before anyone else did. Maya lowered her gaze slightly. I used to help my mother with patients when I was younger. Richard studied her carefully. Mrs. Keller mentioned that you tried warning people before the party. The room grew uncomfortably still. Maya could still hear Evelyn's sharp voice from the night before. The adults are speaking. She swallowed quietly. I did not want to overstep. Evelyn's face tightened with visible shame. Sophie looked back and forth between the adults, sensing emotions she did not fully understand yet. Richard finally stepped closer. Why did you know what to do in the pool? Maya hesitated. Her fingers tightened gently around the folded towel. I went to nursing school for 2 years in Atlanta. Both Richard and Evelyn blinked in surprise. You were in nursing school? Evelyn asked softly. Maya nodded once. My mother got sick during my 2nd year. I left to take care of her. The late sunlight pouring through the windows illuminated the faint exhaustion beneath her eyes, the kind that came from years of surviving instead of living. Richard looked down briefly at the papers in his hand. You never mentioned any of this during your interview. A faint sad smile crossed Maya's face. Most people do not ask. Silence settled over the room again, heavy and honest now. Then Sophie quietly climbed down from the couch, walked straight to Maya, and wrapped her small arms around her waist. The little girl held on tightly, as though afraid someone might still try to separate them. Richard watched the scene in complete silence while evening light reflected softly across the windows behind them. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire who controlled billion-dollar companies realized how little attention he had paid to the people standing directly in front of him every day. That evening, the mansion felt quieter than Maya had ever known it to be. The enormous hallways no longer echoed with hurried footsteps or distant business calls. Instead, soft lamplight glowed across polished wooden floors while rain tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking the gardens. Sophie had finally fallen asleep upstairs after insisting Maya read her 2 chapters from Charlotte's Web beside the bed. Maya stepped carefully out of the child's room and pulled the door almost closed behind her, leaving only a thin line of warm golden light stretching into the dark hallway. For a moment, she simply stood there listening to the peaceful sound of Sophie breathing inside the room. Alive. Safe. Her chest tightened quietly with relief all over again. She only falls asleep that fast with you around. Maya turned at the sound of Richard's voice. He stood near the staircase wearing a dark sweater, one hand resting loosely against the railing. Without the expensive suits and crowded meetings surrounding him, he looked older somehow. More human. Maya lowered her eyes politely. She was tired. Richard glanced toward the bedroom door. She has not slept peacefully like this in months. Silence settled softly between them. Somewhere downstairs, a clock chimed 10 times through the stillness of the mansion. Maya started to step aside politely, but Richard spoke again before she could leave. Walk with me for a minute. The request surprised her enough that she hesitated briefly before nodding. Together they moved slowly down the upstairs hallway where framed family photographs lined the walls beneath soft amber lights. Maya noticed something now that she had never allowed herself to study before. In almost every picture, Sophie looked directly at the camera smiling brightly while Richard and Evelyn appeared distracted beside her. Looking away. Holding phones. Half listening. Richard stopped near one of the windows overlooking the rain-dark gardens below. Water rolled slowly down the glass in silver streaks beneath the moonlight. I built this house 12 years ago, he said quietly. At the time I thought giving my family everything meant protecting them. Maya remained silent. Now I am not sure anybody here was actually happy. His reflection in the window looked tired beside the storm outside. Maya folded her hands gently in front of her. People can feel lonely in very large houses. Richard gave a faint humorless smile. You say that like you know from experience. Maya looked down briefly. My grandmother raised me in a 1-bedroom apartment in Atlanta after my mother passed. Her voice stayed soft and steady, but grief still lingered underneath certain memories no matter how many years passed. We did not have much. But nobody ever ate dinner alone. Richard absorbed the words quietly. Rain continued tapping against the windows while warm light flickered softly across the hallway behind them. Why did you never tell us you studied nursing? He finally asked. Maya shrugged faintly. People see what they expect to see. The answer landed harder than she intended. Richard lowered his gaze for several long seconds. He thought back to all the mornings Maya carried breakfast trays through the dining room. Unnoticed. All the nights she cleaned around guests who never bothered learning her name. All the moments she had existed quietly inside his home while he looked straight through her. "Maya," he said slowly, almost carefully now. She looked up. "Thank you." The words were simple. Quiet. But they carried more weight than any speech he could have given. Maya saw genuine emotion in his eyes for the first time since she arrived at the estate. Not power. Not control. Just gratitude. Down the hallway behind them, Sophie's bedroom door creaked open slightly. The little girl stood there sleepily clutching her blanket against her chest. "Maya," she whispered nervously. "I thought you left." Mia immediately crossed the hallway and knelt beside her. "I am still here, sweetheart." Sophie relaxed instantly and leaned against her shoulder with a sleepy sigh. Richard watched silently as Maya carried the tired little girl gently back toward bed beneath the warm hallway lights. And standing there alone beside the rain-covered window, the billionaire finally understood something no amount of money had ever taught him before. The person who saved his daughter's life had also given this cold, silent house something it had been missing for years. Warmth. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight that spilled softly across the Whitmore estate, turning the wet garden silver beneath the early frost. Maya stood alone in the kitchen preparing Sophie's breakfast tray while the smell of cinnamon oatmeal and fresh coffee filled the quiet room. For the first time since she started working there, the kitchen no longer felt like a hidden corner of the house where employees disappeared behind swinging doors. Something had shifted after the pool. The staff spoke more gently around her now. Even the younger servers looked at her differently, with something close to admiration. But Maya still moved carefully through the mansion, unwilling to believe the warmth would last. People with power could change moods quickly. She had learned that long ago. Upstairs, Sophie was laughing softly at something Mrs. Keller had said while helping her get dressed for the morning. The sound drifted faintly through the ceiling vents, light and alive. Maya smiled quietly to herself as she sliced strawberries into careful little hearts on the plate. Then she heard footsteps approaching behind her. Richard entered the kitchen carrying a thin brown envelope in one hand. He looked like he had barely slept. His eyes carried the heavy stillness of someone who had spent all night thinking about uncomfortable truths. Maya straightened immediately. "Good morning, sir." Richard glanced around the kitchen slowly before answering. "I used to think nobody noticed the people who worked in this house because everything ran smoothly." His voice sounded distant, almost ashamed. "Now I realize the truth is worse." Maya stayed silent. Richard stepped closer and placed the envelope gently on the stainless steel counter between them. "I asked my assistant to pull your employment records yesterday." Maya looked down uncertainly. "Sir? You graduated at the top of your nursing program before leaving school." He paused briefly. "You never failed a single clinical evaluation." Maya felt her chest tighten. "That was a long time ago." Richard shook his head slowly. "Talent does not disappear because life gets hard." Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows behind him, catching faint dust particles floating through the warm air. Maya lowered her eyes to the envelope resting on the counter. "What is this?" "Open it." Carefully, she slid her fingers beneath the seal. Inside was a folded acceptance packet from Emory University's nursing completion program in Atlanta along with a certified tuition payment receipt already stamped in full. Maya stared down at the papers silently, almost unable to process the words in front of her. "Sir," her voice cracked softly before she could stop it. Richard leaned one hand against the counter, exhaustion and sincerity written plainly across his face now. "You saved my daughter's life." Maya looked up immediately. "I did what anyone should have done." "No," he answered quietly. "You did what nobody else did." Silence filled the kitchen. Somewhere upstairs, Sophie's laughter echoed faintly again through the house like sunlight breaking through clouds. Richard looked toward the ceiling for a brief moment before continuing. You saw her. Really saw her. Before any of us did. Maya swallowed hard. The envelope trembled slightly in her hands now. I cannot accept this. Why? Because I work here. Richard gave a faint sad smile. That sentence right there is exactly the problem. Maya looked at him fully then, surprised by the honesty in his voice. Richard exhaled slowly and glanced around the kitchen that employees had occupied for years while remaining invisible to him. For too long, I built a life where people became roles instead of human beings. Drivers. Assistants. Maids. His eyes met hers again. I will not make that mistake with you anymore. Maya felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. Not because of the money. Not even because of nursing school. But because for the first time in a very long while, somebody powerful was looking directly at her and seeing more than a uniform. Upstairs, tiny footsteps suddenly raced toward the staircase. Seconds later Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway clutching her stuffed rabbit against her chest. Maya, she shouted happily before running straight into her arms. Maya knelt automatically, hugging the little girl tightly while morning sunlight poured across the floor around them. Richard stood quietly nearby watching them together, and deep inside he understood something with complete certainty now. The woman everyone once ignored had become the heart of his home. 3 days later, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like the same house Maya had first entered carrying cleaning supplies and folded uniforms. The cold silence that once lived inside the marble walls had softened into something warmer, something slower. Fresh sunlight spilled through the giant windows every morning now because Sophie insisted the curtains stay open. Music played softly in the kitchen during breakfast. Even the staff laughed more freely when Richard and Evelyn passed through the halls. It was subtle, but everyone felt it. Maya stood near the garden terrace arranging fresh towels into a wicker basket while a cool breeze carried the scent of roses through the air. Beyond the hedges, Sophie chased bubbles across the lawn with bright laughter that drifted through the estate like music. Maya smiled quietly as she watched the little girl run beneath the afternoon sun, stronger each day. You are good with her. Maya turned at the sound of Evelyn's voice. The billionaire's wife stood nearby holding 2 cups of tea, her cream-colored sweater moving softly in the wind. Maya straightened politely. Thank you, ma'am. Evelyn hesitated before handing her one of the cups. Please, she said softly. Call me Evelyn. Maya blinked in surprise and accepted the tea carefully. Warm steam curled upward between them while birds chirped somewhere beyond the gardens. For a moment neither woman spoke. Then Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the lawn where Sophie continued laughing. I owe you an apology. Maya immediately shook her head. You do not have to, yes, Evelyn interrupted quietly. Her voice carried no pride now. Only honesty. I spent so much time trying to control everything around me that I stopped seeing the people standing right in front of me. She looked toward Maya fully then, emotion shining behind her tired eyes. Especially you. Maya remained silent. The breeze moved gently through the rose bushes beside them while distant wind chimes echoed softly from somewhere near the pool. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her teacup as though steadying herself. The night of the party, she whispered, you tried warning me about Sophie. Maya looked down. I should have spoken louder. No, Evelyn's voice cracked faintly. I should have listened better. The words settled deeply between them. Honest. Painful. Real. Sophie suddenly looked up from the lawn and waved excitedly toward the terrace. Maya. Look. A giant bubble floated high into the sunlight before bursting above the grass. Maya smiled immediately and waved back. Evelyn watched the exchange quietly, tears slowly gathering in her eyes. She trusts you more than anyone, she admitted softly. Maya's expression gentled. She just needed someone to slow down enough to hear her. Evelyn looked away toward the gardens, shame crossing her face for a brief moment. I was always busy. Charity events. Galas. Interviews. I kept telling myself I was building a perfect life for her. She gave a weak laugh filled with sadness. Meanwhile, my daughter was lonely in a house with 30 rooms. Maya's heart tightened quietly. She understood loneliness too well. Evelyn took a long breath before reaching into the pocket of her sweater. She pulled out a small velvet box and placed it gently into Maya's hand. "What is this?" Maya asked softly. "Open it." Inside rested a delicate silver necklace with a tiny butterfly pendant. Maya stared at it silently. "Sophie picked it out yesterday," Evelyn explained. "She said butterflies remind her of brave people." Maya's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. She carefully closed the box again, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the gesture. Evelyn stepped closer then, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Thank you for saving my daughter." Maya looked up slowly. Evelyn's eyes glistened beneath the soft afternoon light. "And thank you," she added shakily, "for bringing life back into this house." Before Maya could answer, Evelyn did something nobody inside the estate could have imagined only days earlier. She wrapped her arms around her gently. Not as an employer. Not as a wealthy woman showing charity. But as a mother holding the person who gave her child another chance to live. Maya stood frozen for one surprised second before slowly returning the embrace beneath the warm Connecticut sun while Sophie's laughter continued dancing across the gardens around them. 2 months later, the first snow of December drifted softly across the Whitmore estate, covering the gardens in quiet white light. The mansion windows glowed warm against the cold evening sky while golden Christmas lights wrapped around the trees near the long driveway. Inside the house, the sound of laughter echoed gently through rooms that once felt too large and too silent to hold any real warmth. Maya stood near the foyer adjusting the scarf around her neck as snowflakes melted slowly against the dark wool of her coat. A small suitcase rested beside her feet near the front door. Upstairs, Sophie's excited footsteps thundered down the staircase before. The little girl appeared clutching a handmade card decorated with crooked butterflies and too much glitter. "Wait," she shouted breathlessly. Maya laughed softly as Sophie nearly slid across the polished floor in fuzzy socks before throwing her arms around her waist. "You forgot this." She handed over the card proudly. Maya opened it carefully. Inside, written in uneven purple marker, were the words, "Thank you for staying when everybody else was too busy." Maya felt tears sting her eyes immediately. She looked down at Sophie, who smiled back with complete sincerity only children could give. "I am only going to Atlanta for school, sweetheart," Maya whispered gently. "I will still visit." Sophie nodded, though her small fingers tightened around Maya's hand anyway. Across the foyer, Evelyn watched quietly from beside the staircase wearing a soft cream sweater while Richard stood near the fireplace holding 2 travel mugs of coffee. The tension and distance that once lived permanently between them seemed gone now, replaced by something calmer and real. The family looked different these days. Softer around the edges. More present with one another. Richard walked over and handed Maya one of the warm cups. "Hot chocolate," he said. Mrs. Keller insisted. Maya smiled faintly. "Tell her thank you." Richard hesitated briefly before speaking again. "The apartment near campus is fully furnished. My assistant also made sure your clinical schedule stays flexible during holidays." Maya shook her head in disbelief for what felt like the 100th time. "You have already done more than enough." Richard glanced toward Sophie standing beside her. "Not even close." Silence settled warmly between them while snow drifted gently outside the giant windows. Maya looked around the foyer slowly, taking in the soft lights, the decorated tree, the smell of cinnamon and pine filling the air. It no longer felt like the cold mansion she entered months ago carrying cleaning supplies and trying not to be noticed. It felt alive now. Evelyn stepped forward next, emotion already visible in her eyes. "There is one more thing." She handed Maya a small framed photograph. Maya looked down and froze. Softly. It was a picture taken in the garden just days earlier. Sophie sat laughing on Maya's shoulders while Richard and Evelyn stood beside them smiling naturally beneath falling snow. Not posed. Not perfect. Just happy. Across the bottom of the frame, engraved in tiny silver letters, were the words, "Family is the people who see you." Maya pressed her lips together tightly as emotion overwhelmed her chest. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Sophie suddenly wrapped her arms around Maya again and whispered softly, "You are coming back, right?" Maya knelt slowly in front of her, brushing a curl gently away from the little girl's face. Always. The front doors opened behind them as the driver waited outside beside the car, snowflakes drifting through the cold night air. Maya stood, holding the photograph carefully against her chest while Richard carried her suitcase to the door himself. Not an assistant. Not security. Him. Before stepping outside, Maya turned back one last time. The Whitmore family stood together beneath the warm Christmas lights watching her with the kind of love money could never buy. For a long quiet moment, nobody moved. Then Sophie waved both arms wildly from the staircase while snow continued falling softly beyond the open doors. Maya smiled through tears and stepped into the winter night carrying something far greater than a second chance. She carried the quiet certainty that kindness, even from the people the world overlooks, can bring an entire home back to life.